Talk Like an Egyptian, a podcast about ancient Egypt with Dr. Chris Naunton and Izzy Lawrence. In this episode, we talk about the most important river of all, the River Nile. Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Talk Like an Egyptian, a podcast all about ancient Egypt with me, Izzy Lawrence, and over on the other side of the internet, I was going to say, miles from where I am based, is the magnificent Dr. Chris Naunton.
Hello, Izzy, from the far side of the internet. There couldn't be more internet between us, maybe. I don't know.
Indeed. I mean, we can pretend that we are together, but that would be a lie. And, we want to be in denial about that.
Oh, very good.
Yeah, there you
Excellent.
go.
Very good.
We're going to talk about the Nile, which is a very important river. Is it not, Chris?
Yeah, that's understating it, really, isn't it? It is a very important river. It's the river, and it's the source of all life and everything else. Without the Nile, there'd be no Egypt, Izzy. That's not an overstatement.
It would just be a desert, I suppose,
it would be,
which it is either side of the Nile.
It would be yeah, exactly, yeah. It was quite a long time after I started studying Egyptology that I first looked at a modern political boundaries map of Northeast Africa and had a look at the boundaries of Egypt, with Libya to the west and Sudan to the south. It's like just a square, sort of an absolutely dead straight line in between all these countries. But then, of course, why would it be anything other than arbitrary when there is nothing but uninhabitable nothingness desert in between anyway?
It was obviously drawn up by some sort of Victorian/Edwardian British person who'd never even been to Egypt, just with a ruler. And it was probably the size of the ruler on the map, his own personal stationery, that he's just gone, that will do, nice big square. Yeah. What could go wrong?
If it wasn't dangerous for all sorts of reasons, I would suddenly be developing an ambition to go to the boundary just to say, like one foot in. I wonder if you could do sort of half a foot in Libya, half a foot in Chad, and then half the other foot in Egypt and half a foot in Sudan. You could, because there's a kind of four corners. Mm. Anyway, this is not helping anybody.
The ultimate game of hopscotch.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
My background is geography, and I love me a river, and this one's got meanders, it floods, it's amazing. It's got a delta at the end, named after the letter D, because it looks like a D. So sophisticated.
Very good. Yep.
And it's very long, and it flows annoyingly, even though obviously it flows from south to the north.
Yes.
Which means you get Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north.
Yes, which is confusing for people, isn't it? It took me quite a long time to get my head around that. Yeah. But anyway, yes, you're absolutely right to point that out. Yes, so Northern Egypt, confusingly, counterintuitively, Northern Egypt is Lower Egypt. Well, that Lower Egypt is in the north, Upper Egypt is in the south. Wrong way round when we look at the map.
I know, it's annoying because unless we put the south at the top, which I think the Australians would like.
Well, that just shows, doesn't it, the extent to which we're sort of the way that we look at the world on a map. With north at the top and south at the bottom is completely ingrained in us. If we were more ingrained in the ways of riverine transport, and sailing and boats and things like that, then we'd probably come to us much more naturally. I like it also when people talk about the left bank and the right bank.
That doesn't make any sense.
Kind of thing. Well, how on earth do you know which one's right and left? It depends which way you're travelling.
It's one of my favourite things is to look at old maps of the world, particularly medieval ones, because what's quite lovely about medieval England, and this is before the British got an empire and put Britain bang in the centre of it, and everybody goes round the Greenwich Meridian and all of that sort of nonsense. But back in the day, obviously the most important place for the majority of Europe was Jerusalem, because it was the centre of their religion, and so you have Jerusalem as the centre of the map, and which means you get this sort of little sausage sort of jelly bean of England, which isn't quite complete, and they forget Ireland and other bits of it as well. It's just really unimportant, but it's drawn by an English person just going, oh, we mean nothing, right in the corner, which is a complete mind flip to the way that my grandmother thought, certainly.
I was just looking at I'm going to be doing a lecture on the geographer Strabo,
Oh, Strabo, the Australian one.
Truss. Don't think he was Australian.
No, he was
Turkey. He visited Egypt shortly after the time of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, actually, very, very early Roman Empire period. And he wrote about not only Egypt, but also what he called Ethiopia, which is not the modern country Ethiopia, but sort of everything to the south of Egypt, which as far as he was concerned was like the edge of the world. But in the opposite direction, the edge of the world, kind of north and west, was Britannia, strange, cold Britannia, inhabited by strange people and, druids and, all that sort of it's funny. It's funny, just a very different perspective, obviously, from our very Euro and indeed in the past British-centric perspective. Anyway.
We should talk about the Nile rather than
probably.
Maps. I love a geography episode. If you look at a map of Egypt, you're not going to live in the yellow sandy stuff. You're going to live right by the nice wet stuff.
No, exactly. Yeah. So actually, I was kind of making a silly point about straight lines earlier, but if you look at a satellite image now, so just open up Google Maps or something like that and go into the satellite view of Egypt, you'll see this narrow strip of kind of dark greeny brown color winding its way through the center of this otherwise sort of square area. Red Sea on the one side, Mediterranean to the north, arbitrary square boundaries to the west and to the south. And then the Nile snaking its way through. So that dark coloration is partly the river, but it's mostly the fertile, cultivated agricultural land, which runs in a kind of strip either side of the water, following the course of the river from south to north. But otherwise, you're absolutely right. Either side, the vast majority, like 80 or 90%, I guess, of the territory of Egypt shows up in the satellite images, just kind of sandy desert, and it is uninhabitable. There is no life there. It's completely barren. So the vast majority of Egypt is uninhabitable. And if it weren't for that river snaking its way through, the whole thing would be desert, nothingness.
Which also sort of points out the fact that it doesn't rain. Enough. Because if it rained more, there'd be like loads of things happening in the deserts. Things would be able to grow there. But because...
Yes.
By just looking at that map, you know that if you're living there, you are reliant on the Nile and nothing else to grow anything. Because if that Nile doesn't flood, you don't water your crops. If that dries up, you are doomed.
Yeah, exactly. You're quite right. It doesn't rain very often. It's not the case that it doesn't ever rain, which is easy to think. And in fact, I believe, just from my own experience, but also from things that people are saying, that it is raining more and more actually in Egypt, and that's Egypt's that's the way climate change is manifesting in Egypt. Partly, it's also very generally very warm and very hot, even in the winter once the sun is up.
What about at night?
So it's colder at night. Yeah. So I guess because of the absence of cloud cover, I guess this would be, the differences in temperature in the day and the night are greater than they might be in a kind of cloudy country like Britain. So the heat escapes during the night, and it can be cold. Still, I mean, in my experience, never cold like it is here, and it's dry cold as well, which is different from damp,
wet cold
moist,
is horrible.
Cold, yeah. Wales
cold.
But as I say, I mean, during the days, and I spent one season in particular working in a tomb in Thebes, close to Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahari, and we were there. When would this have been? I arrived just after Christmas and had a month, so it was January. And you could see your breath in the morning. So before the sun came up, we'd start work at 7, and you could see your breath, and a cup of very strong Egyptian tea at 9 o'clock was very welcome. And we'd you'd kind of hold it in two hands and clutch it to your chest for warmth. But then as soon as the sun was up, and we were working underground, so slightly unaware actually of such things happening. But once the sun was up and high enough, so by say 10 or 11 in the morning, as soon as the sun's on you, it's just hot. I mean, not unbearably, but it does, of course, in terms of moisture in the country and there being enough water in the environment for things to grow. You're quite right. It doesn't rain, so there isn't that much water around other than either side of the river. But also when it does rain, the water that's in the atmosphere and on the ground is gone instantly because it's warm and generally the atmosphere is dry. So something I've learned, when you're in Egypt, if you wash your clothes, for example, and you hang them out to dry, it's marvelous. You've only got to wait sort of, feels like about 10 minutes. Everything's bone dry. Equally, if I ever have Egyptian visitors, as I do quite frequently over here, you find, oh my goodness, they don't mind kind of leaving water sloshing around everywhere in the bathroom and in the kitchen. I have to sort of say to them, this is not Egypt. That water is going to stay there. That will stay there for days if you don't dry it. And I'm really sorry, drying your clothes, in the winter, if the heating's not working that well here, I'm really sorry. Your socks won't be dry, mate, for a week.
Yeah, a few days. At
but you
least
know what I mean. It's
really
very,
bad,
very different.
Yeah. So when was the Nile first cultivated? I think we have to say cultivated and populated, because obviously there have been nomadic groups wandering around this planet for tens of thousands of years. But when do we have the first sort of signs of sort of like settlement and that sort of thing? Do you know?
The ancient Egypt that we think of, and that this podcast is all about, the Egypt of the pharaohs and of hieroglyphs and pyramids and obelisks and temples and all of those sorts of things. That's the society of the settled Nile Valley population that eventually homogenizes and comes to have the same language and script and religious beliefs and all those things. Prior to that, in the sort of pre-establishment of a recognizable Egyptian culture, we're into the sort of broader archaeological and I suppose before that geological periods of time. So there is a Neolithic, if you like, in Egypt, in the same way as there is a Neolithic in other parts of the world. And the main characteristic feature of the Neolithic period anywhere is the settlement of populations and the beginnings of agriculture. If a recognizable Egyptian culture comes into being about 5,000 years ago, again, oversimplifying here, but let's call it 3000 BC, then in the 1,000 or 2,000 years before that, you have groups coming to settle in the Nile Valley for the purposes of providing themselves with a reliable, dependable source of water, obviously, but also sources of food. And of course, animals would be living also where there are plants growing and there's a ready supply of water, which the Nile provides. Just the animals and the pre-existing plants would have provided a source of food. But it's not too long after that before people start realizing, so we can start manipulating we can start hunting and killing the animals. And we can start manipulating the plants that are growing here and cultivate crops. And after a while, you have agriculture in that period. As I say, of 1,000 or 2,000 years, slightly outside my comfort zone. Do ring in or send us a fax or a postcard if you know more precisely, listeners. Or a papyrus. Send us a papyrus. Yes, absolutely, you can read those. So it's that sort of period.
So you've got all these disparate groups and they're arriving in the Nile. How do they get together and go, we are now Egypt? What's the story there?
Well, so again, I suppose it's worth pointing out that different phases in ancient history provide us with different kinds of evidence. And once you've got this recognizable Egyptian culture, one of the markers of that is the establishment of writing and hieroglyphic scripts and eventually other scripts as well, and also of iconography. So in other words, words and pictures, which are incredibly helpful, of course, in allowing us to understand what people were thinking to some extent, what their beliefs were, and also events that happened. We're much more in the dark when it comes to those earlier periods before things are being written down. So we can't say with any certainty what the precise sequence of events would have been. But we can see that if we're thinking of this, there being this moment about 5,000 years ago, 3000 BC, when Egypt comes to be unified. Again, we can't be absolutely sure about this. And we're still arguing about the extent to which our sources should be taken at face value or not. And we can talk about what those sources are some point.
Kings saying how great they are, largely.
Yeah, exactly. or somebody who looks like they might be a king. If there is that moment, and if that corresponds to the beginning of what the much, much later Ptolemaic era, 3,000 years later, historian Manetho thought of as the beginning of Egyptian history and the beginning of the first dynasty, if we're right in thinking that all those things align, then the period before this is what we'd call the pre-dynastic. So when we think about the pre-recognizable ancient Egyptian culture, that's the word we should use to refer to it, the pre-dynastic. What was the question?
Well, it's kind of like how the Egyptian economy sort of got set up and all became unified, because it's a very long, drawn-out country. What
Yes.
kind of... And it's really in two bits as well, because it's very different in the Delta to the rest of it. We've got to get onto the flooding and everything else as well, but I'm just sort of like trying to manoeuvre you into a downriver, as it were.
Working backwards, I think we can't escape mentioning an object which was discovered at the site of Hierakonpolis in I think it was the very end of the 19th century. This is a ceremonial pallet, we call it. And these had a particular shape, quite large, sort of foot and a half kind of high by, I don't know, about 8 inches, sort of wide at the top, tapering downwards at the bottom. Quite thin, flat, inscribed on both sides, and a palette in that it would have been the kind of thing that would have been used to mix pigments like an artist's palette, whether that would have been for painting, say, on a wall, or whether it was for making makeup or something like that. Anyway, these are ceremonial palettes, so they didn't have that practical function, but their design takes their inspiration from those functional palettes.
It's weird. Can we just say how weird that is? Just to say that this is a very ceremonial thing that we're going to make look like an artist's palette. Why?
Well,
I mean, of the things to choose, not like a sword. We got ceremonial swords. That kind of makes sense. Ceremonial shields. That kind of ceremonial makeup equipment is weird.
I suppose it's maybe a little bit surprising. And yet, of course, we're talking about a time when there are hardly any objects at all. And most of them might have had a rather more prosaic function. So if you've got, say, a hand axe, that's the sort of thing you might use to wallop an animal.
They did make
or
ridiculously sized hand axes, the Neolithic people.
They did.
So,
they did. And some of those things had
Yeah.
ceremonial function as well. But if you imagine that a palette is made, I'm sort of speculating here. Imagine if a palette is made in order that somebody could apply makeup, or, some sort of body decoration. And the people who had the body decoration were the really important people, maybe the sort of spiritual elders, or maybe the high priest or something. Then that object, which is unique to that person, and perhaps they only put the makeup on at the time of the incredibly important religious ceremonies, that object then takes on a very particular significance. We might think, well, you're mixing paint. What? But, that might have related to some sort of incredibly important event and would have been the preserve of some incredibly important person. Anyway, this palette that was discovered at Hierakonpolis is decorated on both sides with images that are actually a kind of slightly rudimentary form of recognizable Egyptian iconography. So you've got somebody wearing crowns that we recognize, and you've got animal-headed gods, and you've got a falcon, and you've got a bull, and all these, somebody wearing horns, and all these things that come to be an established part of Egyptian iconography of Pharaoh. And this guy appears to be biffing people over the head. And these people are represented by what we recognize as crenellated walls. These are fortified walls. And again, working backwards from later Egyptian iconography, we would understand these to be representative of places. And a big man wearing a crown, holding a mace and biffing people, is the king conquering foreign people. So the way this has been interpreted, but there's still lots of arguing about it, is that this is the moment when the first king of the first dynasty, by military conquest, takes under his control the other groups of people in the Nile Valley and in the Delta. And there does already seem to be that duality of Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, Nile Valley, Nile Delta. Maybe he takes over the whole country, and that is the moment at which everybody is under the control of a single ruler. The first pharaoh. And that is also the moment, again, we can't be absolutely certain, but maybe this is the moment, or maybe this is symbolic of actually a series of stages in a process that played out over, years, longer, where this person then imposes his culture, maybe his language, maybe his way of making pottery, maybe his style of architecture, maybe his sort of temple buildings and his gods and all those sorts of things. He imposes that over all of the groups of people who previously were just separate, disparate groups along the Nile Valley and in the Delta, but they're now all under this one guy. And he says, well, actually, you're going to be speaking my language now, mate. And brings everything, it creates a single unified culture. Probably not a very nice moment for a lot of the people in the Nile Valley. Probably quite a lot of people weren't very keen on this guy, who was probably not the nicest bloke. But this is the moment. Again, if we're right in thinking of it as being a single moment, this is the moment ancient Egypt comes into being.
And it's on a giant makeup palette or other paint mixing palette.
It's an extraordinary. I mean, you'd never, just looking at it, you'd never know that's what it was for. It looks like it looks more like a sort of steeler, but then a steeler is nothing but a slab of something with a flat surface that you can put.
Yeah, it looks like a heavy sort of a tiny metal shield type thing. It's kind of weird, but not really. It's odds. I know the one you're thinking of, and I cannot recall its name. Can you recall its name?
We haven't said its name. How silly of us. This is called the Narmer palette.
Narmer.
The reason it has that name is that the two hieroglyphic signs, one we read as Nar, the other one Mer, are enclosed in a rectangular shape. Yeah, exactly, which we call a serech.
Cartouche. Oh no, serech. Sorry.
Well, a serech. It's the cartouches don't come in. Cartouches, which are the sort of lozenge shaped,
cartouche shaped,
name ringing cartouche shaped indeed. If you're in the French military, you know that comes from the French soldiers' rifles. Anyway, special names, the names usually of pharaohs, sometimes of gods, sometimes of other members of the royal family, sometimes princesses or great royal wives or that sort of thing, are enclosed. Even before people could read hieroglyphs, they recognized that probably something important written in that enclosure. And on this palette, those signs Nar and Mer are written in a serech, which we believe therefore is the name of this big bloke with a mace going around and whacking everybody. So we tend to think of Narmer as being the first pharaoh.
Excellent. And that's his palette. Cool.
And sorry, back to your original question. So how do all these disparate groups in the pre-dynastic come together? Most probably, it's a gradual process of more and more and more and more people arriving, more and more people establishing themselves, maybe kind of peaceful exchange, bit of trade here and there, somebody wandering up to the next village and go, blimey, I like the way you're ploughing your field. I'm going to plough mine like that.
Nice bit of irrigation you got there.
Exactly. Lovely irrigation. I like that. And so everybody's sort of eventually cottoning on to the same way of doing things, but also it does look like from the Narmer palette a little bit of I'm going to take over here and I'm going to do that by being more powerful than you and biffing you on the head.
I think the point is that they were able to grow enough food that not everybody had to farm all the time. They could fight. And that sort of is, what you need.
Yes, that is very important. Yes, the idea of agricultural surplus. I'm glad you've mentioned that. We're into sort of state formation here, really, which again is the sort of thing that is not obviously unique to Egypt. It's sort of fundamental part of the development of civilization anywhere in the world. There comes a point where, thanks to agriculture, usually there's more food. The group of people is producing enough food that not everybody has to devote themselves full time to producing food or the other essentials of life, looking after children, looking after the elderly, whatever.
Or in the nomadic times, walking to where the next food source is.
Just going around and trying to find somewhere to sleep for the night and, et cetera, et cetera. So once you've got an agricultural surplus and you've got, I suppose, a settled place to be and security and protection against the natural environment and predators and maybe even disease to some extent as well, then people can start doing other things. And what other things do they like doing? Fighting. You can start taking other people over. I mean, to some extent, that might have been necessity as well. I mean, perhaps poor old Narmer's farming methods were rubbish. And so he wasn't able to feed himself and his population. So he thought, right, better go and steal someone else's food.
There's also this thing that makes the Nile particularly special. It's not like other rivers in the sense that it's really quite predictable in that it does flood, and it floods roughly at the same time most years.
Yes, you're quite right. On an annual basis, there is what we call the flood or the inundation, when there's suddenly a lot more water coming down the Nile Valley from much further south in Africa. And so the Nile eventually bursts its banks in Egypt, depositing large quantities of water onto the land either side. Also at the same time, silts, which are being brought again from much further south in Africa. And those silts in the water are also dropped on the land. And that silt, turns out, is itself extremely fertilizing. That provides the water source for the crops. So there's a brief period when the land is in an inundation, and essentially it's completely flooded everywhere. Maybe this is the moment to say as well, this doesn't happen anymore because of the dam.
Aswan Dam.
Yeah, exactly. So there have been 2 dams at Aswan. The High Dam, so-called, was built in the 60s. There was a previous one, but this is the really, really big one. So it's at Aswan. Well, it's a few kilometers south of the city of Aswan. So at the sort of southern frontier, it's not quite the modern geopolitical frontier of Egypt, but it's at the southern end of the inhabited part of the Nile Valley in Egypt. And so everything downstream from that, everything north of that now, in terms of the flow of the river, is controlled from the dam. And what that means is that the inundation doesn't happen anymore. So rather than there being one huge flood event that drops masses of water and silt onto the land in one go, the water is regulated throughout the year. But there was still an inundation up until the 60s when this dam was built. So there are photos and there will still be people around who could remember the inundation. And if you see photographs of it, it's absolutely amazing. You know, it's like the whole place is underwater, under a few feet of water, you know, maybe not more than that. So you can see people sort of rowing boats around temples and statues and things like that, or, you know, or in some places kind of walking around with their water buffalo, that sort of thing. So this provides the water and it provides the silts. It also creates a really nice kind of annual cycle for the country. It gives life a rhythm in the valley, along with the seasons, of course, but it makes it's a much more kind of dramatic marker in the year. So there's this cycle of flood, then the growing season when the crops are growing. So once the waters recede to the point where you can get back onto the land and start planting things and arranging your crops and things, there's a growing season, then there's a harvest season. And this is absolutely essential to life in Egypt. And the vast majority of people in the country would have been involved in agriculture. That's what most people would have been doing, right, in some way.
But my favourite thing is when this inundation came in, because the ancient Egyptians, obviously, they had their, you know, this is my bit of field and that's your bit of field. And we'll just put in some little stone markers to sort of like separate the fields apart. And of course, every time the inundation came in, those markers would move, which means really early on, you had the absolute need for lawyers and people to litigate all of these different things, which meant you're going to need to learn to write, to, you know, arbitrate the decisions, which kind of like drives the whole culture just because you have neighbours arguing. It's how I've sort of imagined it anyway.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly part of it, but also it's important to say actually. So the dam is a modern thing. Mm. The High Dam was built in the 60s. There was another dam that was built, I think, right at the end of the 19th century and raised a couple of times. But anyway, the first construction was end of the 19th century. So modern. But the Egyptians were, from even before the time of the first pharaoh, they were manipulating the river. So in a sort of, in one very simple way, relatively simple way in which they did that was to kind of dig channels running off the river to divert the water into, you know, towards their fields. They built large basins with gates at the front of them so that the water could sort of spill into a basin and then be kept there and to then be released later down these little irrigation channels. And this manipulation of the river and the natural landscape to regulate water and silts and being deposited on the land goes back thousands of years. There's a really fundamentally important book on early Egypt called Early Hydraulic Civilization in Egypt, and that just the title alone gives you the sense that actually this is the most important aspect of the establishment of Egypt as a great civilization in the beginning. Is not just the presence of the river, but the Egyptians' ability to manipulate it and manage it as well. And as you're quite right, what follows that fairly closely is then an administration. People start to realize, well, hang on, we've got to start counting things up here. And actually, well, those crops are yours and those ones are yours. But you need to know how many of those you've got and you need to know how many of those. So you've got to count those and then probably write them down. Oh no, we need writing. I mean, I often say it seems like an amazingly kind of boring a part of the reason why ancient Egypt becomes so successful. But it is that it's farming, and then it's also having a really, really good administration and a system for organizing resources and people across a huge territory under a single ruler and a single administration with a single set of laws and people to enforce them. And as you say, eventually kind of lawyers to make judgments on these things.
And how did the ancient Egyptians see the river? I mean, they saw it as a god as well, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, as a general rule, every one of the important aspects of their natural environment, their world, comes to be embodied by a god, usually. So yes, there was a god of the Nile called Hapy, who, yeah.
I know, in English that's lovely.
Yeah. It was typically depicted with rolls of fat, like a very fat person. And you might think, oh, that's a strange thing for a god. But actually, of course, what that's meant to convey is the sense that it's full of life. And what the Egyptians wanted, of course, was for Hapy to be big and fat and full, and therefore to deposit lots of water and silt on the land. Having said that, of course, something we didn't say earlier is that you're absolutely right. There is this very predictable, dependable cycle of flood, growing season, harvest. There was an unpredictable element to this as well, in that the level of the flood changed. It wasn't absolutely the same all the time. Most of the time, it was within a sort of range that didn't cause any trouble. But very occasionally, you get a low Nile, or a series of floods that were too low, not enough water, not enough silts for enough food to grow. And then occasionally you'd get a flood that was too high. And the flooding could be very dramatic and very dangerous, actually, of course. So a really high Nile is going to kill a lot of people, first off. But also, if the water doesn't recede quickly enough, you've not got enough of a window for plants to get growing and then for the harvest. So again, both of those things would lead potentially to problems with harvest. And if this goes on for a number of years, as it did, and we've got good records to show that there were times when there were years and years and years where, it wasn't in the right range, the flood wasn't in the right range. And that causes problems. But one way the Egyptians mitigate this is to store grain, and to store it for years in granaries. And again, you've then got to have, people to administer this. And in fact, one of the elite positions relatively early on in Egyptian society, one of the most important people would be the Ini Shenuti, the overseer of the granaries.
Nice. Good job to have. Unless there's mice, which is you might need cats, but we're not doing cats today.
No. Another episode.
Indeed. So they sort of personify the god. How do they placate Hapy then? I mean, because I presume that, if the Nile doesn't flood or floods too much, that means Hapy is not happy. So how do we make him happy?
Yes, you're quite right. So having established that things like the river and also the sun and, all these other important natural phenomena could be personified as gods, they then have personalities. And so the sort of natural variation in the level of the Nile is attributed to the god being placated or unhappy for some reason. As far as I'm aware, we don't have a huge amount of evidence for exactly what people were doing, but I think it's safe to assume that they would have been saying prayers. There may have been shrines. And again, I'm not aware of there being, any sort of any great temples specifically dedicated to Hapy. he wasn't the kind of god who would have a great big stone built cult temple that you'd go and worship. There may be more likely smaller shrines built by people who had more of a direct a connection with agriculture. The cult temples, of course, are built by pharaohs with loads of money, and they were maybe less bothered about farming. I mean, obviously, ultimately responsible for it, but maybe it was the ordinary farmers who had little shrines that they would place offerings to at a certain time of year or make prayers.
So we should talk about boats, because obviously that is how you get about in ancient Egypt, and actually Egypt a lot of the time before the roads really got going. So talk to me about the importance of boats. We've already talked a little bit in the last episode about how they personified the dead going into the Duat by boat. So talk to me about boats.
So you're absolutely right. Another important feature of the Nile, or attribute of the Nile, is that it allows people to move about. There was transport in other ways over land. There would have been roads and trackways. It would have been much slower and much harder work.
And not horses for ages. I think
not horses, no.
I mean, they had horses, I think, what's it, 1300 BCE, something like that? They had...
by slightly earlier
but they were
than
kind
that,
of fashionable things. It's like having a Lamborghini. There wasn't, it's not like they were used day to day. They'd have had asses and donkeys.
Even now, most people don't have horses in Egypt. Most people in Saidi Egypt, that's the countryside Egypt of the Nile Valley, and in the Delta, indeed, most ordinary people, for getting around. I mean, you might have a car or a motorbike, but a lot of the time people get around either on donkeys or with donkeys pulling carts still. But it's slow and uncomfortable. You certainly wouldn't be able to travel long distances that way. It would just take too long. Whereas travel on the river is much easier. So again, this goes back before the beginning of the first dynasty, a long way. We can assume had boats and had developed good boat building techniques that would allow them to move up and down the river. So this was a way of transporting people, if you like. If anything, even more importantly than that, it's a way of transporting resources. So once you get to the point where people start to want to build, particularly when you're building in stone and you're wanting to get certain kinds of stone from certain kinds of places, but then, say your quarry might be over here, but then your temple that you want to build might be hundreds of miles away, then that stone goes on the river. Again, once you're at the point of having a unified Egypt, you've got to be sending people around the country to sort of manage things. But most importantly of all, you've got to be sending information around some way or another, whether that's orally via a messenger, just going from A to B and saying, I want you to do this, or whether that's transporting information in recorded form, written form on a papyrus or something like that from A to B. But again, it's the river that enables that. So it's the primary means of transport, but it's also the primary means of communication. It's the way of getting information around the country. So boats are absolutely essential. And again, you're absolutely right. Referring back to our previous discussion about how the Egyptians imagined that even in the imaginary netherworld, the way you get around is on a boat.
No, it's imaginary, Chris. It might be real.
Sorry, not imaginary.
Don't know.
Not imaginary.
It might be. It might be imaginary.
The possibly or possibly not imaginary Duat. I'm going to feel very stupid in the Duat.
Well, no, you're not. You're going to be like, we're all going to be following you, going, "Help! Well, who's this?"
I'm going to love it. I'm going to be like,
you and Anubis are going to be like that, and we'll be following you, going, "What's going on?"
Can't wait till 5-6 o'clock. Meet all the pharaohs. Amazing.
If you don't bury yourself with a little dagger, you'll be annoyed with yourself. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking of sort of a couple of guitars. Actually, that's a bit big anyway. Well, we'll talk about this another day. What were we talking about?
We were talking about how the religious ideas come into boats and the river. And stuff.
Yeah. So just as in the Duat, they imagine that journey's made on a boat. Indeed, they, all good journeys are made on a boat. So, a journey made by the sun through the sky comes to be sort of made on a boat. And indeed, the journey that's made by Pharaoh to the next life comes to be made on a boat. So pharaohs start to be buried with boats. They start burying these huge boats in association with the tombs of the kings in order that the king has got an actual boat to sail off into the sky in. If you look across the full span of dynastic Egyptian history, we have boats do survive, mostly from those funerary contexts. The best one, I can't resist mentioning this. If you don't know about this, you must.
I'm getting excited already.
There was a boat buried with Khufu at the Great Pyramid at Giza in a specifically rock-cut, boat-shaped boat pit next to the pyramid. Actually, there was more than one.
A boat sarcophagus, almost.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of dismantled, but otherwise ready and waiting for the king's spirit. That boat was fantastically well preserved. I mean, it is unbelievable. That with this word is overused, but it is unbelievable when you see it as it's been now put back together and on display. It used just up until very recently, they had built a special museum next to the pyramid that you could go in and look at the boat. They've now moved it to the Grand Egyptian Museum, so you'll be able to see it there. But it is unbelievable. I mean, you would think that it was made yesterday. It's so well preserved, and it's a full, great big, I don't know what it is, like 30 or 40 meters long boat. Just like some of the boats that we see with very distinctive prow with a kind of tall papyrus stem motif carved into wood at the front of the boat. Just like the kinds of things that we see in depictions on tomb walls or in iconography elsewhere, or even in hieroglyphic symbols. Absolutely amazing. And if you look out across all the evidence we have, particularly the boats themselves, and then also depictions on tomb walls, because you see boats all the time. Tomb walls are often decorated with scenes essentially relating to kind of daily life, and boats are essential in daily life. So you see lots of them there. You see people on boats hunting and fishing, or going off on expedition somewhere. But they're also essential for the journey to the next life. So there's boats everywhere. We have masses of evidence for it, and there are whole great big books in the literature of Egyptology just on ancient Egyptian boats. I got very excited then, didn't I?
I know you did. I mean, the boats are cool.
Boats are cool, yeah.
To this day, they're a status symbol. So, that is still the thing.
True,
what we're going to do is we're going to record a little bit extra, maybe talking about, because the thing is, I'm a geographer. I know that rivers don't stay still and how that affects the ancient Egyptian people.
Yes.
But we're going to record that as a little bonus after this.
Okay.
But thank you so much for listening, everybody. We are going to say our classic ancient Egyptian farewell, Chris, and it's going to be as slick as all previous times. Oh, okay. We'll get a hang of this.
Couldn't be more slick, could it? Really?
Exactly. So, if you've enjoyed this episode, please do find our Patreon and all the rest of it. But until then, 3, 2, 1. Life. Prosperity. Health.
Well, that was as vigorous as we've done it yet.
I think that was. I was convinced. Thanks for listening to Talk Like an Egyptian. To support the podcast and ensure another series, join us on patreon.com/Talk Like an Egyptian and unlock bonus content. Get in touch, talklikeanegyptianpod@gmail.com, or use the hashtag TLAE. We need your questions for the end of the series, so please don't hold back. Remember to leave us 5 stars of newts and share this episode with your friends. Find all links at talklikeanegyptian.com.